computer.
Awesome.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to our creativity and a little bit looking at neuroscience and actually understanding the relationship between creativity and the brain. Tonight, I have with me Dr. Sunny Naicker, and he is both an epidemiologist and a neuroscientist. And he's going to take you a little bit more about his background, but I think it's actually worth saying this is a creative session that we have to put titles on people. We have to say what you do and how you do it, but it's actually quite limited because if you actually say, well, he's the scientist and I'm the creative person, it's just all kind of
not true, like,
weird. Yeah. And there's a lot more to everybody than actually first appears. So yes, Sunny has some serious qualifications in his area, but we are all more than that. And yeah, tonight we just want to kind of take you through some of the mysteries of the brain, but this is less a class in neuroscience. You can get that someplace else. And more our discussion about what we think about the brain and how it actually works, and some of the things that we're actually exploring and interested in when it comes to creativity.
Yes.
Cool. So, if for those of you who don't know me, I have a background as a Master's of Science in Creativity. I've written a few books, including this obligatory book plug. Yes, can we see it? Great. But tonight, as I said, I have a special colleague and I would say a close friend and a collaborator, Dr. Sunny Naicker, to kind of talk to us. So
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I think we're going to go through more of a Q&A session this time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So
tell us a little bit about
yeah,
your background and why you're here today, because there are lots of neuroscientists in the phone book. I could have called anybody.
But they aren't. All right.
No, they aren't you.
Well, a couple of things. I think my story or background is kind of a testament to not staying in your lane. It's one thing I hate, the idea of stereotyping ourselves and our skill sets. And it speaks to this idea that we're all kind of think we need to be worker bees, when I think it's so much more nuanced than that, and how we should be able to think. So I've always been interested in people, and what are the things that drive us? What are the things that make us do what we do? But more so, I think more fundamentally also, what is that thing that gives the personal flavor to your thoughts? What makes you you, and what makes me me? And I think we sometimes call that consciousness. And really it was a quest to understand how we can begin to even conceptualize this and unpack it. So I eventually led to a doctorate in neuroscience, and it definitely taught me many things. I spent some time working on and really appreciated how reactive our brains are, how plastic they are. And in fact, much of my work was in understanding how the environment, how the external environment and outside stimuli actually kind of reorganized the brain circuitry, and how that reorganization actually had a fundamental impact in how we behaved and how we responded to things. But it couldn't still not answer that more fundamental question I was yearning for. What is the thing that gives our thoughts flavor? What is the thing that makes me me and makes you you? And the reason why it couldn't up until relatively recently, and we'll get to some of those things, we'll unpack some of those things, is what I was asking without understanding at the time fully was I was actually asking a metaphysical question, not really a scientific one, right? And for a long time, metaphysical questions, well, one is, what does metaphysical mean? And really, what it really refers to is where we don't actually have obvious physical correlates to kind of infer cause and effect to phenomenon. And science isn't really interested in that. In fact, I would argue it's not interested in it at all. Science is actually simply a method. We refer to it as a scientific method to experimentally observe phenomena and actually observe and understand how one thing can affect another thing. And it usually almost always has natural correlates. This isn't the case for the flavor of you or the flavor of me. We have some kinds of correlates, but I couldn't tell you absolutely those are the things that make you you and make me me. In fact, we very poorly understand consciousness, and we're getting better at it. Certainly, technologies and techniques and our understanding of it is kind of moving forward, but it's a relatively new phenomenon. So it's funny because I was kind of still doing that. I'm like, well, this is not really answering that fundamental question. And at the time, the universe kind of had other plans for me. My dad got really sick with cancer, and I decided through a lot of thinking that maybe I was better off turning my talents to fixing that problem. So I did. I went in and studied clinical epidemiology and public health, which is really a timely thing right now. I understand. It's really about the cause and distribution of diseases, the things that actually result in people getting sick, but also the things that can actually prevent them from getting sick, and what might be the best and most efficient ways to treat people, not just at an individual level, but at a population level, at a global level. Now, this might seem like disparate things, and this is why I say, like, I'm not about boxes, but in fact, fundamentally, they're all actually answering similar questions. What are the things that make us us? You know, what is it that makes us human? What drives our responses? What motivates our behavior? How can we determine them? Can we even determine them? Should we even bother? And how can we use that understanding to hopefully make a better world? So really, in short, that's where we're at. And yeah, that's a bit of my background. Yeah.
Cool. Of the two kind of areas that you've actually studied,
Yeah.
do you have a preference or a yearning, or is it something actually bigger than that that actually drives you?
Yeah, I think it's the fun. I think unpacking the human condition,
Yeah.
really, and that's a very metaphysical thing, but it's true. It's, well, what is it that define us and actually connect us, make us who we are, and what are the realities that stem from that, either both, not just as individuals, but also as a group, as a collective. How can we relate to each other? How can that relational work change the world around us? And I think humanity, human beings specifically, are quite unique. I wouldn't say that we're unique in the sense that we're the only conscious entities or life on the planet. I think the jury's still out on that very strongly, and we'll get to that in a sec. But unique in the sense that we actually physically change and transform our environment, as we know with climate change and just change in general. We have the ability to create complex and sophisticated social structures, which then of themselves become complex systems that almost exist outside of us. And in doing so, we kind of really transform our natural world for better and for worse. And so we're in a special place, and we have a heavy responsibility, and we should wield that with caution and consideration and with care as well. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about, from a neuroscience point of view, how do you define creativity?
Right, sure. And that's actually not a straightforward question. Yeah.
I just want one answer.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
We'll start with that.
Yeah.
So keep in mind, a neuroscientific point of view is a very incomplete point of view.
Yeah.
I can only define creativity in that way using a very specific framework, or a very specific epistemology, a very specific knowledge framework. And that's around actually looking at what the physical correlates are with this thing that you do, this action, this behavior, this thought that you have that you associate with creativity. So with that regard, there are some studies and there's some work that has been done recently whereby people, test subjects, were given specific tasks that actually allows them to imagine scenarios. And we were actually able to monitor their brain activity using something that's relatively new. It's called functional magnetic resonance imaging.
Right.
So fMRIs.
Yep.
And what those do is they don't just show you what regions are activated, right? But how much activation occurs. Yeah. And we found out something really intriguing, actually. Really, well, to me, not surprising, but I think it's really changing the game and how we think about this phenomenon, but also in consciousness in general. So I'll give you a bit of a story to that. I know you said one sentence, but I can't do it. Yeah. So prior to the invention of fMRI, the only way we could actually understand how the brain affected our behaviors is through comparative neuroscience. So that's where we used animal models to infer certain similar outcomes that were analogous to humans. This isn't a small thing. In fact, fundamentally, most vertebrates, that is, things that have a spine, share very similar central nervous systems. In fact, the rat brain isn't all that different to a human brain. It's a matter of scale and a few nuanced changes, but largely surprisingly similar. So how we would usually do that is we would actually place an animal into a controlled experiment something that looked like a maze, and would often change the thing that it needed to get. Usually a treat. Rats love, like humans, treats, right? And we actually found that rats did something quite unique that we didn't quite expect quite consistently, that was very similar to humans. That they were able actually to project in different frameworks, right? And make certain cognitive projections in terms of how they can locate that information. So what they were actually engaging in, I would argue, is a very different but similar form of imagination.
Yeah.
Yeah, a very basic form of imagination, but I wouldn't even use that word. This is called imagination.
Yeah, because I wouldn't necessarily say that's
Yeah.
basic.
No,
It's
no.
what we could measure, if you know what I mean.
And what's so special about that? The thing is, we don't think of this as special because it's actually inherent to how we see and view and be in the world. We use this all the time.
Yeah.
But even the world's most complex and sophisticated supercomputers can't do this. So what portions of the rat brain was activated while they were doing this, right? Is actually very similar to the type parts of the brain that's activated when people do this. So we call this the default mode network, right? So one thing about brain science and brain anatomy, I think that's a little bit misunderstood, is that the brain itself isn't a 0-1 tool device. It's not a digital computer, right? It's actually far more complicated than that. And it's all in a spectrum. So when I say these things are activated, it doesn't mean other circuits aren't activated too, right? It's a matter of proportionality, right? So in this case, when the rats were actually trying to figure out new ways of navigating a maze as it changed position, their executive functioning part of the brain, the part of the brain that's able to actually project, was activated, right? We call that the frontal cortex.
Okay.
We also have a frontal cortex.
Yeah.
The other part of the brain that was activated is what we call the cingulate cortex. So that's the top region of the brain. This is the region that actually integrates episodic memory from what we call the hippocampus, right? And the last part of this sort of region is actually called the parietal lobe. That's the part of the brain that actually processes sensory information and that relays that to the frontal cortex. Now, all of these things aren't activated in a kind of chronological way as far as we can tell. They light up together, right? With neurons, and neurotransmission happens very quickly. And we don't actually understand the nature of neurotransmission. We have some hypotheses. There's something called Hubbian networks, but it's beyond this. But it doesn't work. It's not a direct correlate to computing, to binary information, or even to electrochemical signals, right? They're good metaphors, and they kind of sum up some of the activation, but we don't quite know fully how this happens. So I can't tell you which region activates first, and the proportion of which region activates first. We just know they all do, right? And this is exactly the same thing that happened when we actually put on fMRI hats onto people and measured what regions were activating when we told them to imagine scenarios, we gave them creative scenarios to think about. We actually asked them to imagine different landscapes and stories. We actually also told them to read science fiction novels, and there's a couple of different experiments. So the same regions that activated during the rat brain, when they were doing the rats were doing that task, activated when humans were doing that task as well. Not unexpected, but quite profound, right? A supercomputer, unless the supercomputer knew all of the rules in some kind of computing language that is already predefined and categorized, this would be an impossible task. It's just, can't do it, okay? Computers don't make projections into the future, given some rules, applying those to other new contexts. What they do is actually make rule-based algorithmic decisions. Quite different. Now, this actually hints at something deeper, right? It actually hints at something fundamental about vertebrates and fundamental about kind of the cortex itself, and how it's able to actually navigate reality through projection and through imagination. It may offer a kind of connection between the metaphysicalness of consciousness and the kind of science of neuroscience. There's something deeper that's going on. There's a particular framework that's using, but it's also, you see how I use the word imagination, imagination, imagination.
Yeah.
I could have also used the word creativity, creativity, creativity.
Yeah.
So these are constructs that strongly overlap with each other.
So what does this all mean? That certain areas of the brain light up, that we're able to forward project, and that we're not that dissimilar from rats and potentially other animals.
Yeah.
What does this? I don't know if you can answer this, but what does this kind of mean in the greater sense? I mean, where are we going?
Well, now I think you're asking me a metaphysical question.
I am asking you a metaphysical
the funner question.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's why we have really two definitions, right? So I think I can only tell you that these areas are associated with what we see. We don't know if they're the only areas, but we know there's some functional relationship. I can tell you that it's actually so commonplace in invertebrates that the rodent brain works in a similar way, in an analogous way to the human brain. But and as far as meaning goes, I'll give you my own personal view on that. I think it actually means that creativity is the heart of living things. How far that goes, it's probably on a spectrum rather than just an on-off switch. So, the more attention and more conscious an animal is, probably the more they're able to make predictions and imagine in different ways along the spectrum. And what does that mean? Well, it's kind of a pretty cool ephemeral thing. It's pretty special. To me, I think it means that we are really bloody cool. I think we're really profound. I think we have actually the ability to work through and anticipate and imagine all kinds of potentials and possibilities for ourselves and our communities and our civilization. And the boundaries are few and far between. I think sometimes we kind of feel closed in by what I call epistemology, that is knowledge frames. But guess what? We create that epistemology. You can also change it. So I think it's fundamentally important to understand how much space there is out there and how much power is in that space, in our shared and our collective humanity. Because I don't think creativity is just a singular endeavor. I think there's a connectedness to it. So this is completely my subjective value judgment of what that means. I mean, what does it mean to you, Pauline?
Well, I think that the way I've been kind of trained is to actually think that it's about novelty, it's about original ideas, it's about thinking outside the box. And I do think that is a rather limiting definition of creativity.
I agree.
I think we underestimate how often that we are engaged in a creative practice, which is the fact that who we are is actually a work of fiction. To a large degree, it is, and I don't think that we appreciate that, because a lot of people will say to me, "But I'm not creative," and I'm like, "Well, you've probably got a pretty creative definition of who you are, because it wouldn't actually gel with my version of who you are, or your parents' version of who you are, or friends." And yet and particularly when we're creating problems, we are creating all the stuff that goes around the problems and how we envision the problems. And I think by limiting creativity to novelty and or just problem solving, I think we've done it a disservice and haven't actually opened up our eyes to the fact that everything that we manifest, the way that we interpret it, is creative. Because there's kind of no such thing, without getting too metaphysical, as truth.
I mean, I personally use creativity interchangeably with consciousness, and that might be too flighty for some of the audience, but that's just my own viewpoint on it.
Yeah, I must admit, over time, that I've gotten there myself, in the fact that I don't know how you distinguish these things. But then again, you end up in this rabbit hole, which is really hard to navigate as well, because what is consciousness? Who has it? Who doesn't? Who rocks? And
I have something to say on that.
Go for it.
In a moment. So I think it's really ironic that we kind of obsess over something we all experience on a daily basis, right? So what does it mean? Well, what do you think it means? And I think this kind of the supremacy of science, which is vitally important, can tell us a lot about the world. But I think this kind of forcing science to answer metaphysical questions isn't all that helpful. And also kind of placing that in an hierarchy, like placing belief systems, maybe valuing things that you believe far less than what the science tells you, is probably a bit of a fool's errand anyways. Because here's the thing, that the science can only unpack some of it, right? But you also experience it. So because you experience it and it can't give you the entire kind of value of meaning, does it mean that your experience of it is less value, is less profound? That sounds kind of insane. Right? So I would actually throw away the entire frame and really think about it. Well, how does the knowledge base inform what I understand and know? But also this thing that I can do. Well, what can I do with it?
Yeah.
Okay. What are the outcomes that I want to make occur through it? And what does that look like?
Yeah.
And it's really about reframing that question, I think. And it's kind of an epistemological trap. For those people who aren't familiar with that term, it's just a fancy term for knowledge frameworks. And I think we can overcling to those, and it creates a kind of bias where we kind of utilize the knowledge frameworks that actually are causing the problem to begin with to solve it. So you get into this kind of weird trap, if you like, and create straw man arguments for things.
It's a bit like Einstein said that you can't actually, paraphrasing, and whatever, the same thinking that caused the problem won't actually be able to actually solve the problem.
Yeah.
It requires a different type of thinking.
It really does.
Yeah. So I guess, from what we've kind of talked about is that more than anything, I think our shared kind of definition is more about the ability to reframe things and not necessarily get trapped in things. And I think we've talked about from the beginning about being careful about boxes. You're a scientist, I'm a creative expert, and what all these
I'm also
mean.
a person.
Exactly. And the
Yeah.
sense of that just because you can't prove something doesn't mean you can't know it, and that it's okay to lean into this. And I think there's a third thing. I think that we actually keep science away from philosophy, where I think there was a time when all of these things were actually interchangeable, and that you could be a scientist, philosopher, and in some ways, I think when you reach the top of your field, you have to bleed into other fields in order for you to make sense of what you're actually understanding at a deep level, because you start to question everything.
Yeah.
There's a name for that. The
ontology of
no, that could be, what is the effect that when the more that you know, the less that you know?
Oh yes, the Kruger-Dunning effect.
Kruger-Dunning
Yeah,
effect.
that's right. Yeah,
exactly. The more that you go up there, so I think the more that you actually.
Well, it's and the inverse of that is basically the less you know, the more you think you know. It's actually what the effect is. Yeah, which is kind of dangerous. Yeah.
And I think to some degree that you've reached some of the tops of your fields and actually starting to mix things like epidemiology with neuroscience. And even with creativity, and again, artistic. I mean, you're also a poet. And
the point being is we're still figuring these things out. Like, you have to, at some level, you're going to talk about the metaphysical. How could you not?
Yeah.
So that's a very nuanced thing. So I'm not saying everything applies all the time. Actually, what I'm saying is utilizing information in a critical way to develop some context around these things is a way to inform some of the experience, but it isn't the only way. And so you need to leave room for those spaces, because in those spaces, you'll find other ways of looking at issues and other ways of reframing things. And also to imagine, a big space that needs to be left. And for us, because we'll get to this, right?
We can go there right now.
Is how profoundly important imagination is.
Yeah.
It's kind of vital.
Yeah. I think probably one of its greatest things, and we've talked a little bit about this in the past, is about dreaming.
Yeah.
And I think that we are very careful about what is realistic and what is not. And I think we are schooled and educated in being practical about how we actually conceptualize things and making sure it's grounded in something, that it's not too flighty. And I kind of think on one level that is bollocks. Because if you don't actually believe in something, if you can't actually enter into imaginary worlds and actually entertain them as real, and not even for a nanosecond, for like actually entertain them as real, then we are denying a part of who we are. We are denying our humanity. We're not just here to solve problems.
Yeah, and this really dumb, false dichotomy that you either have to be a critical and analytical thinker or an imaginative one. What is that exactly?
Yeah,
that's utter nonsense.
Yeah,
I still hear that sometimes in different forms.
Well, to be fair, I'm sure a lot of people actually do think that there's quite a big difference. And I think, in fairness, we're educated that there's critical thinking and creative thinking. And I think you're quite right. It forces this dichotomy of thinking, and it puts a value judgment on critical thinking being more important than creative thinking, which is just kind of insane. But yes.
Well, I think there are different ways of thinking, and we're capable of both, as we are with several other ways on top of that.
Yeah.
The brain is complicated.
Yeah.
And then some.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it was Sir Ken Robinson.
Yes.
Said that we kind of have the creativity schooled out of us.
Yes,
is that right?
It's educated out of us. He recently died, but he's the #1 YouTube speech, which is about creativity, or video TED Talk. I forget what it is, but over 1 million views. Yeah.
And I think that's more than just like a platitude of speech, right? I think it really does. It does occur. And there's reasons for that. Right? People need to be competent and be technically good at what they're doing. But we're capable of so much more. We can be technically competent and write science fiction stories if we so choose to.
Yeah.
That is okay, folks.
Yeah.
I think that's as the world is actually, as systems are becoming more complex, which they
Yes.
are, and has technologies actually allowing us to access a wide array of knowledge, that ability to do those things is actually going to increase. I think we're going to move from being worker bees into actually being able to solve complex and nuanced problems with creativity. I think this is like a fundamental skill set that we're all going to need in the 21st century because we have some complex problems coming up.
Exactly, and I think some of the problems is the way that we're framing them
Yes,
currently, and the way that we're looking at them is actually going to hinder our way of thinking.
Yes.
So we're going to have to learn to actually question the frames that we have in place, or question the knowledge sets
Yes.
that we have, or the ways of viewing, defining, categorizing things, and starting to be more blurring and breaking those down. I think if we're going to actually make some breakthroughs.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So creativity will be at the heart of this next generation's thinking, or
I mean, it's kind of always been at the heart of what drives us, right?
But what drives us as human beings, I would agree.
Yeah. But I do think that we've kind of become more conveyor belt.
Yeah.
In how we learn skills. There's kind of been a social kind of bias against too much of it. I mean, like being a dreamer, it's got negative connotations, doesn't it?
I've yet to find a metaphor for
Yeah.
dreaming that's actually positive. Almost all of it is negative. Well, I've actually not found a positive one in the English language, so it tells you how much we value it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And more deeply than that, there's also something deeper about creativity and how it actually not just connects us to each other, but as I was saying, there's the question of other life, other animals, right? We're going to go into this.
Well, I mean, this is every subject in my life goes back to my cat Thomas. So little Thomas is going to make it a moment later. I mean, so in your opinion, I have mine clearly. Does Thomas have an imagination?
All right, I'll tell you a little story. Doing neuroscience completely and doing it at the level of a doctorate and doing it at the level where I was creating new knowledge completely blew my mind and reshifted my entire thinking around animal rights, animal ethics. The reason why is because I using rodents, right, to actually then project out and make analogous assumptions on humans. It means something, doesn't it?
It does.
Right? It means that there are complex creatures with complex emotions and complex ways of navigating the world. And the evidence was there. It was overwhelming. It kept mounting and mounting and mounting. The very fact that we use animal models to actually understand human brains tells us something about animals, and it's unavoidable. So I think we kind of, that's this idea and creativity in general and neuroscience in general and the idea of consciousness actually, it opens a can of worms in terms of, well, how can we actually navigate this space ethically and with the life that we share, with the animals that we share the world with, and what does that mean? And I think that's an ongoing question. I know you've got some opinions on that.
I actually do think that, I don't know, well, I do. I was going to say I don't know where our bias, but I do. I understand that we have very much a bias towards human thinking and understanding, and that we don't, and you can't prove it, you can't apply it, you can't prove that my cat can imagine it and all that kind of stuff. But then yet when you're actually interacting, and it also comes to a function of industrialization, where we're no longer living with our creatures other than the odd pet. That kind of actually allows them to be that and us over here. And I think that if we were more amongst nature and more in tune with it, I think we would actually understand that there are different ways of conceptualizing the world and that they are no less creative.
And I think there's some practical implications as well. So one of the ways which we kind of need to reshift to reconceptualize the world, the more deeply we come to terms with who we are and what our brains are capable of and what does it mean to be conscious, is actually renegotiating the ethics as well, and the ethical contracts and the social contracts we live by. That's how you transform and change society. I'm not saying everyone should be vegetarian because animals are deeply complex, but I am saying perhaps we need to rethink our practices in terms of the agricultural industry and how we actually value and frame these issues. So there's real practical implications that this can lead to. I think a lot of the time metaphysical thinking is often seen as something being up with the clouds, but actually it can be quite practical. And in fact, some of the great social breakthroughs that we've had with the fact that, people aren't slaves, that I'm allowed to get an education with all of you, right? And that you can vote. Actually, it's a function of those things, and we should talk about them more openly because society wasn't the best place for a lot of people 100 years ago.
Still isn't.
And yes, and the reason why that has changed is through it's a function of breakthrough thinking.
Yeah.
It's a function of actually refusing to kind of stay put with the status quo and actually leaning into something deeper, something more profound. And creativity and ethical thinking, you know, or ethical decision making are deeply aligned and they overlap strongly with each other.
Yeah. This is actually a really interesting part of the conversation. So go on a little bit from your own personal experience about some of these overlaps that you've experienced.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I've also been interested in working on is it's kind of a heady term, but the ontological convergence, right? So what is the yeah between mathematics and ethical decision making?
Between mathematics and
Yeah,
ethics.
yeah.
Do they have anything in common?
They have a lot in common.
Go for it.
Yeah. So I think one of the kind of myths that we have, I'll get into this very shallowly, but in a way that kind of, you know, people can follow. So one of the things we kind of misunderstand about how we work is that we've already divided people out into being highly mathematical and then, you know, highly musical. In fact, the analytical part of the brain, the analytical thinking, is only for some types of maths, and only for the very superficial surface parts of maths.
Algebra?
Not even, I would say arithmetic, right?
Yeah, okay.
But as you delve deeper into theoretical mathematics, it becomes a highly creative, almost metaphysical field.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the way with which you actually diverge and converge and ideate, right, is not that dissimilar to the kind of ideation that occurs for people that have actually engaged in different types of ethical decision making, right? And they've now started to look at the convergence of this and actually the brain areas that are involved. And surprisingly, they're similar. Like, again, the story is, you know, thinking through, connecting, asking questions, and kind of connecting to our humanity as similarities. It's kind of crazy that I'm saying maths and ethical decision making go together, but actually that it's not that crazy to theoretical mathematicians and neuroscientists who understand this stuff. There's very similar brain processes used. Now, I'm not saying it's exact, right? But what is that similarity? Is it worth unpacking? And is it worth talking about, right? And what's the relationship between these things, you know? We've barely, you know, kind of into that and alluded to empathy, but it also forms a substrate of this. In fact, there's work that shows the more empathetic you are, the more imaginative you are, which kind of makes sense, right?
Right.
Because it's like, well, what is it like to be in someone else's shoes? Well, you have to imagine some of that if you don't have the experience.
Yeah.
And you can imagine that with like quite a bit of specificity as well.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. So there's more going on here than meets the eye.
So for someone who's not good at maths or for whatever reason, I'm not that good.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about how the convergence can be ethical, or how that sorry, and I'm making this bad, but how those two actually have a relationship. Because the way I see mathematics potentially is very binary, and I know that that's not what you're talking to.
No, and it's not binary either. So that's probably a failure of our system in some ways, right? Yeah. It kind of leaves those sort of those other aspects of the philosophy of maths, if you like, to a certain proportion of people, and it's barely even mentioned in school.
The philosophy of math.
Yeah, which is integral to understanding maths in general.
Yeah.
So really, what it's speaking about, what maths does is actually looks at how we can not use ontology, so the kind of the substrate of categorizations, right? And look at how we can understand information without context, right? And then how that actually leads to a lot of sort of non-linear, what you call divergent decision-making processes in the brain, right? When you kind of inherently disagree with something in society, you may not have many examples of this disagreement, but you might have a belief system that what that person is experiencing, right, might actually not be right, because you can imagine what it might be like to be them. That same imaginative process, right, that's actually used to make kind of non-ontological decisions about reality and information, right, and that you might use to be empathetic to someone else's experience, it activates very similar brain regions.
Got it.
Yeah. And I've always, I don't think it's all that unusual, right? It speaks to, well, basically how fascinating and complicated, but also how kind of integrative our minds are.
Yeah.
If that even makes sense to people. Yeah. I was reluctant to bring this part up, but you asked it. I wasn't actually going to have this in the conversation. It's a little heavy-handed, but yeah.
But I mean, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is because maths actually, to some degree, takes it out of context, that this is actually...
Let's drop the maths part. Yeah, okay. The idea being that is actually...
that in order to solve problems, we need to be empathetic.
We all are capable of all kinds of integrative and ways of thinking.
Yeah.
So this idea that we can do one thing and not another is probably a myth, right? We can probably do them in different degrees, but it's not so much what we can and can't do, it's how we learn it. And we probably all have slightly different learning styles. We also learn things through a very specific epistemological framework that actually advantages some types of learners over others.
Yeah.
And it's not the only ways with which to learn information. That's far more important, than the maths per se. That makes sense, yeah.
But I think if I understood you correctly, that you are actually saying that in some ways to understand problems more deeply, regardless of their format that they come in, that we actually need to be activating our empathy, which is a form
absolutely.
of imagination.
Yeah, I am saying that.
Yeah. And so
empathy, imagination are very. I think empathy is a function of imagination. Yes.
But in that sense, maths is useful because it's something that we see so abstract and so far away from that. But that's actually bringing that back into the conversation, it helps us to reframe what we think we know.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And in fact, that's probably why I use both of those examples. Not just my own experience in working in those fields, but also why. Why would I be interested in those things? It's that reason.
So it kind of comes back for me that the more deeply that you understand things, the more adjacent that you're interested in, that you're no longer within the silo of what you're learning, but that you actually have to bleed into other areas and bring connections together in order to actually take your experiences deeper.
A pretentious term I like to use, just to myself, but I say you transcend epistemology when you do that. You would just say you get creative. Yeah, definitely.
But I think what we're saying is that you transcend the framework that you're given and can look outside it and more integrated.
Very much so.
And I would think, my experience is that that's also a physical reaction. We're looking at the brain now, but I actually think when that integration occurs, it occurs throughout your body. Is that correct? Or at least that's my experience.
I would say would have to, right?
Yeah.
Because we are a function of the neurochemical and other reactions in our body.
Yeah.
And it's more than just a reaction. It's an embodied experience.
An embodied experience.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I can't say definitively, but yeah, probably makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, a little piece of trivia that I've been given, it could be correct or incorrect, or maybe you can put some more nuance around it, is that the brain doesn't just exist in the mind, in the head, in the skull, to be more specific, that there is neurons around our heart and our gut. Is this correct, or is this a little bit
I'll put some nuance around that.
Thank you, because I think it probably isn't nuanced.
Yeah. The brain is an organ. What you're referring to is the central nervous system.
Yep.
Right. But we also have what we call a peripheral nervous system too.
Yep.
So we don't just have a central nervous system. Together with the brain, they make up, I guess, how we respond and exist and be in the world. And it's quite integrative. We don't, they all play roles. And then when we think they play these roles, and then they go and play other roles, and it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and you get the iceberg problem.
Yeah.
But we know all of that is fundamental, some kind of quality in vertebrates that allows us to be how we are. Yeah, it's probably the things that help give flavor to your unique thoughts and give flavor to my unique thoughts. But no, it's not just the organ of the brain. Yes.
Yeah. So practically, does neurons exist around my heart and in my gut?
Kind of, yeah. So you do have nerve endings, which you can kind of categorize as neurons. Yeah, they're very similar in how they work and how they transmit information.
Yeah.
But they probably look physiologically slightly different, but their function is similar. Now, form versus function is another question. We won't go down this just yet. But yeah, functionally, yes.
Okay.
Similar.
But I would think that if you might also argue that, in fact, that we tend to think of thinking again as going back up into the brain, and this is stuff that occurs here, and forgetting that, we are a system in a body that's in an environment, and that all of those things influence our feelings, our thinking, how we actually...
Yeah. So one thing I think this also, biology is probably overly ascribed to be scientific, and in fact,
Yes.
it's really is a complex system.
Yep.
Complex system are called that for a reason. They actually have their complex systems are irrational systems. Now, it doesn't mean what you think it means. It basically means that it has a level of unpredictability. So the individual parts of that system actually behave separately as opposed to all of the parts, right? Therefore, making it unpredictable, depending on how you look at it. And therefore, yes, this is why medicine, for example, is difficult. It's an art form.
Right.
And this is why we can only answer some questions, but not all. And then we're still not even sure if it's all physical. I can't tell you that definitively.
Yeah.
And anyone who says so is kind of lying, or they don't actually understand the scientific method. I can't.
Yeah.
I think so, but I can't.
Yeah. So in fact, this is all it requires an imagination to actually deeply understand things.
It does, yeah.
And it keeps coming back to it requires a level of empathy.
I agree. Yes, I think it does.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is a personal question. Do you think people who struggle to actually be empathetic, do you think that it's something that it can be trained? I mean, I believe creativity can be trained and taught, but
I think the vast majority of human beings are empathetic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lack of empathy, despite how it might be presented in pop media, is very, 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 very rare.
Yeah.
And even then, I'm not sure. I'm not so sure. So yeah.
And I think something that we've discussed a lot is that the context matters.
Yes, context always matters.
Yeah, so that you may be a very unempathetic person in a lot of circumstances, but
for conscious beings, context always matters.
Yeah, but it doesn't always mean that you actually are always.
That's right.
Yeah. Cool. So tell me a little bit about how creativity has impacted your life, particularly maybe recently, in some of the thinking about where you might be going with some of these thoughts.
I think it all comes back to wanting to understand the consciousness, right?
Yeah.
I couldn't begin to even start to think about answering that question if I didn't really start to delve into the metaphysical and then also give into what it means to be creative.
Yeah.
Well, there's also different ways of coming to terms with that as well. I wasn't just interested in sciences as a kid. I was interested in the humanities as well, and also I had a right to be interested in both. Yes, that's one. Yeah. And to me, it kind of made sense, right? This kind of understanding something in terms of how do you unpack the black box is a different kind of thing to understanding something as an outcome of experience. And to fully begin to understand, you need to do both. So, you need to probably be in a punk band and work in a lab, and you should.
And you should.
That's all I have to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So out of curiosity, are you going to start a punk band, or have you actually had a punk band?
I've had a few attempts. You've missed it.
Is there some recording somewhere on YouTube that we can actually see?
Maybe. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much a big conversation.
It is a big
people,
conversation.
Right?
So may I say that maybe one of the outtakes is never grow up, or never
imagine.
Yeah.
Like don't be afraid of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you give us any practical tips on how we can actually learn to actually embrace this side of ourselves?
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think actually daydream and imagine more. I think this has been so kind of marginalized that people can't bring themselves to actually think about, or even here's the thing, I'm pretty sure we all do it.
Exactly. It's just that we consciously kind of shoo it away.
Talk about it more. Normalize it. Give yourself the space and time to do it. Imagine all kinds of contexts. Do whatever works for you. It's your life and your brain. But don't shy away from that. And think about what that means for you as well. And it can actually raise critical consciousness, as you begin to unpack how you imagine what your dreams are, what your drivers are. And you might not find the truth, but who cares, right? It's actually about the experience, not the content necessarily. And I think that's sometimes hard for people to get.
It's interesting that you talk to, you might just find the truth, but I think what
you might not.
I think what you're actually kind of saying, that's not a fixed concept.
No.
It's equally as big as imagination, and it's movable, but you might actually find something more.
Yeah. I'm really speaking about the experience of imagination as opposed to what it is.
Yeah,
it's almost not as important. I don't think.
Yeah.
That can come later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a little side question. Out of curiosity, there has been some fairly recent press about the ideas that psychedelics and drugs and LSD and stuff like that may actually be ways of actually dealing with trauma and maybe, yes.
Let's be really careful what I say here. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Censored.
Yeah.
This is all your personal point of view anyway.
No, I'll give you two versions.
Okay.
The official version is, yes, we think that psychedelics, well, empathogens, which are actually quite different than psychedelics chemically.
What are empathogen?
MDMA specifically.
Oh, is that,
yeah.
What is it called? Ecstasy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
We think it actually can be utilized effectively to treat some forms of hard or treatment-resistant depression and be very effective in post-traumatic disorder.
Yeah.
Because, well, it induces easy access empathic feelings, which allows people to unpack traumatic memories in a safe environment.
Easy access to empathic feelings.
Yeah,
okay, so it's very much the area of creativity
it's
that
almost
we've been
shortcut
discussing.
Stuff. Yeah, the circuitry. And induces, all kinds of experiences that's probably very akin to the creative experience. And it's currently, there's clinical trials right now in Europe and in the United States. Results should be out in about 12 months' time, I'd say, how effective this actually is. Now, without evidence, I can't tell you anything more than that. Sure. Like the evidence is mounting. But there's a suspicion based on the experience of others and based on the kind of understanding of how it affects the brain that's probably helpful. Now, acid is a different story. We think so. Yeah. It does reorganize and remap the brain. We've only very recently been able to actually understand what really happens with LSD, with fMRI. And we do know that it does do some very interesting things. It actually, the wiring and the functionality and the activation of the brain looks very similar to what an infant's brain might look like, which would kind of make sense, right?
Right.
For those who have had that experience.
So it's all connected as opposed to...
Yeah, everything appears to be hyper-connected.
Yeah.
Now, whether that's beneficial or not, we don't know yet. There are thinking about trials. It's a lot trickier to actually to study the effects of LSD clinically than it is MDMA because it just lasts longer, and there's more unintended consequences associated with it that we're still trying to figure out. Yeah. But in terms of how we kind of define harm minimization, we do know that neither drug are what we will actually, classify as too harmful, right? So in terms of like Schedule 1 drugs, we know that empathogens and psychedelics, their harm probably is more about the unpredictability of behavior and the unintentional consequences that arise from taking them behaviorally. But we aren't sure if there's an addictive property associated with it, and that's generally how we classify harms along illicit substances. Yeah. We don't think there is. So there's probably, because there probably isn't, physiological path to addiction. Doesn't mean there isn't one psychologically, by the way. Let me preface that. Yeah. But because there isn't one that we can isolate and we know of, it probably means there's probably some room for therapeutic intervention sometime in the future. Yeah. But we will see. The jury's still out. Yeah. The evidence is still getting there, and it's not quite there yet. So, if you don't want to make any generic statements.
No, understood. Yeah. If you had to make an intuitive response, would you actually venture that or no?
I don't know yet. Yeah. I'll give you the politician's answer. I don't know. Yeah. We'll see.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. Cool. One last thought I would like to explore is recently I read an article that was by neuroscience talking about the fact that basically our brain is new every day, that we reimagine ourselves every day and bring this. Do you agree with that, or do you have anything to add to those thoughts?
Could you repeat the question for me, sir?
Basically what he's saying is, and I'm just asking you, do you agree, is that basically we're a new person every day? Because as we wake up, we make new connections and our brain almost reinvents us and ourselves every day.
I guess so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, again,
I loved it. It sounded quite poetic. You're just kind of like,
I guess it's a nice thought.
Yeah.
It's very poetic.
It is very poetic.
If you want to be, I guess.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know if I'm answering the way you want to, but yeah.
No, I think you can answer it the best way possible.
Yeah, so, I think we have lenses, metaphorical lenses with which we see the world.
Yeah.
And in those metaphorical lenses are intention and choice. And that's really about how we make sense of the things around us and how we actually obtain meaning from that. And meaning is quite different. We have all kinds of different belief systems, and we have a choice over which one we use. So in that sense, yeah,
So
I
we can
guess.
wake up every morning and make a different choice about how we see the world.
We can, or more intentional
from that
choices
off.
or less intentional choices. Yeah, it just depends on our belief systems. I happen to have a very humanist belief system.
Yeah.
So, I think that, we're all actually are capable of great compassion and empathy, and we have a kind of almost spiritual calling to safeguard the planet for ourselves and everyone else. And we're all deeply connected by virtue of who we are, what we are. And it's only a belief system. I can't really. I'm not interested in arguing that in terms of why, but actually arguing for what are the outcomes that can result from that. I think that's far more interesting and important. So yeah, it just depends on your belief system, I guess. Yeah.
Cool. Well, we're going to actually open up the floor for a Q&A, but before I do, any last pearl of wisdom that you might be a bit putting the pressure on, but any last thoughts that you might like to add?
Don't be afraid to dream and listen to each other's dreams as well. That's also probably important.
I think it's maybe encourage others to share them and not necessarily judge them.
I say so.
And when I talk about creativity, I talk a lot about the ability to defer judgment. Not necessarily. You can judge, just sometimes just holding on.
I guess I'd say be a person. Be a person.
Or be yourself. Be a real person. Yes. Cool. Well, on that note, yes, we'd like to actually open up the floor to any questions anyone might have. Yes. Hello.
Hello. Great stuff, guys.
Thank you.
There's lots to unpack there.
It was actually quite a deep conversation.
I put down like 20 different points, so I'll pick one. I think one thing, I've recently been reading *Sapiens*. You guys read that?
Yes. It's influenced.
A few of the things you're hitting on, which kind of... Yeah. Oh, great. Because one thing, I think you were talking about like imagination, creativity, and it's something I've grappled with over the years about kind of this storytelling part of it, and how it can feel like it's a legitimate kind of career or a legitimate thing that I can be, selling to clients or I'm kind of chasing as a career. And it was only once I read that book and kind of what you guys are talking about, where it's linking storytelling with these kind of imagined realities that are the reason that, humans can actually collaborate and then have this advantage over other animals, right?
Yes.
I don't know. So yes, I think you guys are just hitting on some of the kind of advantages of creativity that humans have. But there was an interesting link between kind of that and then the rats you were kind of talking about as well, the rats experiment. I don't know. So you were blowing my mind a little bit in terms of like all animals have creativity, and I'm juggling with this. Okay, but what's our kind of evolutionary advantage then if we also have creativity at this different level? Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, a couple. I might just sort of package them with a bit of nuance, I think. So I think something about evolution is a little bit misunderstood. And I've heard this term evolutionary advantage a lot and kind of applied to all kinds of settings. The only thing evolution cares about, right, is reproduction, right? It's only a sexual advantage. Everything else is up to you. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think we kind of get too caught up into this idea of, well, what does that mean evolutionary for us and makes us, uniquely human? What is this? And it's actually not really. Evolution just cares that you survive and that your offspring survive, and they survive to reproductive age so they can go make more offspring. The rest is actually, that's what makes us different. And the rest is actually on us. It's, well, how can we utilize our sophisticated organizational structures and communication ability to then transform the world around us? I don't think evolution cares, and nor should you.
I'll give a slightly different answer. I mean, I was really intrigued by that book about the idea that concepts are something, and symbols and our ability to actually believe in things, because concepts are symbols to some degree, is given us something that we actually goes forward. And I think that, and this is very much our frame of actually looking at things, is that we think about it, it's given us an advantage, or it's given us a status or a hierarchy in things that over other things. And I think instead, I think we should actually look at it as a responsibility. And we should look at it as a leveler, and that we actually owe more to those that, by having that higher conceptualization, I think we actually have greater responsibility. And yet that's not how we frame it. We do frame it as we have more control over, or we are smarter than, or we are more entitled than. And I wish we would actually peel that back and go, well, if you have more knowledge, it's like a parent. If you actually have more knowledge, you have more responsibility to actually wield that knowledge more appropriately.
Also, I'll say my kind of precocious response really was actually about, well, we have the responsibility. It doesn't matter why. I think we're always trying to kind of, it's this kind of bias with cause and effect. We always want to know, well, why do we have the responsibility? Well, how about just because we do? That's okay.
I will come at slightly different again, because I think the why is important, because I think as innate storytellers, if we can't put a why around it.
True.
And I think that the
but
why.
My point being, it's a belief system. We don't have to justify the belief system. We could just have the belief system.
True, but I think that the why actually puts it back into the ethical framework.
The problem is if you spend too much time justifying a belief system, this is when you run into problems.
Yeah.
When things like, well, we've seen these problems happen. We've seen genocides happen. So this is why I kind of think it's very tricky ethical territory. And in terms of, well, if you believe in humanism, right, these are the reasons why you might believe in it. It's entirely subjective, right? But it's actually in our collective well-being. That's enough. Because then we can get into all kinds of, evolution has been used to pour us on misunderstandings of evolution, has been used to justify all kinds of ghastly human acts. So this is why I'm very careful in how we kind of utilize that and say, well, it kind of doesn't, it doesn't give you, Darwinism was never about epistemology. It just was a very kind of sort of analytical understanding of how things came to be. And the only thing it sort of like is able to answer sufficiently is, well, why do some organisms thrive as opposed to others? And the reason which they do is they live long enough to reproductive age. That's it. It doesn't care if we're all to 20 or 30 or 40, just that we live long enough to keep reproducing. You see, that's quite a different thing.
Yeah.
The rest is all us. Yeah.
We did go a little bit off piece, but yes, and have different points of view on this.
Yeah.
Oh, I like it. It's interesting. Yeah, they're just from different angles, which is really.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's more different angles.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
But what I do think is really beautiful about that book, Sapiens, is having an anthropological look at the way that we view the world and culture. And I think that that is what we use our creativity more than anything else. Sure, we use it to build tools and technology, but it's informed by our culture, and it's informed by what we believe that these concepts should actually do. So I do think that it's a really interesting take on the world. And yeah, it certainly opened my eyes.
Yeah, very good. Very good. I've got one more then.
Go for it.
The part you're talking about reframing, I think it's epistemology, taught me a new term. Yeah, your kind of created reality, or what you are, like you're in a creative field, you're a doctor. And then that other point, kind of tying together the less you know, the more you think you know. And then bringing it into the context of now in terms of like political divides and, you know, kind of the racial drama that's happening in the US particularly. You know, we're more divided than ever. Creativity feels like it's more important, and imagination feels like it's more important than ever. You know, how can you get people to kind of understand that more and maybe be more imaginative to break out of their frames?
I would say empathy, practicing it. And there's different ways to do that. I think people respond to being seen, in my personal experience. You know, if you actually hear someone out and show that you're actively listening to them, and then respond in like, you know, ask questions and know who they are more than just like what they're saying, because what we say doesn't reflect the entirety of our being, of our souls. And so we're more than one thing, and we're more than just a dangerous political belief, for example. We're more than just, you know, a Trump supporter or whatever it might be. We're also other things. We're also mothers and fathers and poets and writers and thinkers and strugglers. You know, it's like a kind of Springsteen effect, right? I think he was really great at that. So that's my answer, I think. Yeah.
My answer is sometimes actually, which we don't do, is to understand a little bit the other side. And if I said we and somebody else does. I fair enough, but I think sometimes that we get caught in the tropes of they think like this and that's clearly wrong and it's disadvantaging people, and we think like this, and it's like, well, there's a reason why they think like this. And I think sometimes that we don't give enough credit or understand fully why people feel so disadvantaged, so angry, and feel like there's been injustice caused to them. And I think until that you can actually defer that judgment and actually look at some of those instances, yes, you can judge, but we go in with the frame of judging. And I can actually appreciate how the fact that for certain Republicans, this liberal point of view is obnoxious, because we're coming from a point of view where we've got things where pretty much we're not being racially discriminated every day. We've got wealth, and it may not be wealth, but we have our needs met. And so it's quite easy for us to say, well, we should just honor all men and do the right things. We haven't been treated like crap. And I think until you really understand some of the anger that's actually driving that and some of the deeper injustices, then I think you actually, we can go into it more deeply. The French used to have a way of arguing, which was that you can only actually have an argument if you could actually argue for every side. And that's a bit where Four Corners, the idea, came from. And until you actually do that, you don't understand your perspective. And there's a certain degree to be said that I think that we've polarized ourselves and actually justified our stance without actually appreciating that there's aspects, even if we find them reprehensible, about someone else's point of view. It's come for a reason, and to actually step into that. That's saying empathy as well.
This is power storytelling.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that we can all be quite polarized without sometimes even realizing that we are polarizing ourselves.
Do you think, because you've touched on like anger and people being polarized, and probably more emotionally invested in things rather than thinking through them logically and from another perspective, do you think kind of anger or other emotions have a negative effect on creativity and imagination?
I don't. I actually think that they can actually be quite the catalyst to creativity. And I think that we have this spectrum of good emotions, bad emotions. Good emotions are happier, that they make us feel better, and that bad emotions are stuff. Anger exists for a reason. There are times when your boundary is crossed and you need to be angry. It's harboring anger and nurturing anger and actually taking it to an extreme, as likely being overly happy and denying yourself other aspects, is where things get actually weird. But actually appreciating that you have all kinds of energetic states, all kinds of emotional states, and all of them serve a need, but maybe being aware that they're still serving you and that they haven't just outworn their welcome.
One of the things I alluded to but didn't clearly articulate was when I talked about MDMA utilized to actually treat post-traumatic stress disorder. But I did use the word safely unpack emotions. And what I actually was referring to is unpacking traumatic memories, which then are actually colored and filtered with a specific emotional feel in a way that actually allows people to not just maybe understand them, but also creatively work with them. So it's not uncommon in these sessions that are currently being trialed that people will draw their stories or paint their stories or compose music with their stories. And that's a version of how they're actually using emotion creatively in a safe way.
Yep. And even for me personally, I mean, my sister was dying of ALS, motor neuron disease, when I was actually doing the same degree that you are now, studying for my Master's of Science in Creativity. And one of the things that I was really confused about was I was supposed to feel horrible. Now, there are moments of grief that are quite horrible, but it's also quite cathartic. And I had the opportunity to actually go over a period of 3 or 4 years. So you actually get to manage it as opposed to a sudden death. But that was one of the things that really struck me, was this was supposed to be a really horrific time of life, and yet it was so much more nuanced. There was aspects of it that were actually quite beautiful, and no one told me that. And I was like, oh, it's a symphony. It has drum banging. It has, little birds flying off. It's a symphony. And then I thought, it's got me starting to think, well, creativity is just a part of life. It's just our emotions. And it's burbling or coming up all the time. And it's just how we work with them. And we can actually try to suppress them, or we can try to just work with them and live more synergistically with them.
Well, I think another point I was bringing up is people who have PTSD might need MDMA to do this, but everyone else can actually unpack dangerous ideas or emotions safely. It's just about giving ourselves the time and space to do it, unless there's a reason not to, like post-traumatic stress disorder or other mental health disorders. But if someone isn't experiencing that in a clinical way, we actually do have the ability to do that. We just don't talk about that. We can peer into the darkness and unpack it. In fact, we probably should, it could, again, lead to all kinds of different ways of thinking and different positions and more ideation. So there's a reason why dangerous ideas are actually important. So yeah.
There is also someone who I forget, I think it's Penniman, who actually talks about the ability to write, and those people who actually write, because what they're actually doing in their writing of trauma or writing of their story, even not even trauma, they're reframing by the actual going through it, because there's no such thing as memory to some degree. You color it every time you bring it up. By going through those kind of things, you're actually reframing how you perceive it and changing your narrative so that it's more resourceful for you today. So anyway, it's a complicated way of actually looking at some of these things, but I think that my internet connection is unstable. Yay. Hopefully it works. It's actually looking at, not being so black and white about things and actually appreciating that all of these things are useful. It's how we harness them that counts.
Awesome. Very cool.
But I do think with creativity, we don't talk enough to that, because we do talk about it as ideational energy, which is usually up and joyous, and it is much more nuanced than that when we're talking about the full spectrum. And artistic creativity does actually deal with it. There's the trauma of not coming up with an idea, the joy of it, etc. And for some reason, we've divided them. It's not some reason, it's the 50s. We've divided them a little bit to some of the things that you'll learn in your study, and they really shouldn't be. They're one and the same, whether you're solving a problem or you're engaging in an artistic act. To some degree, you are in the same energies.
Yeah, that's probably really important to call out, actually, the ups and downs of it. Because like you just said, whenever you're trying to do some sort of creative endeavor, you do go through this is the best thing of my life, to, I'm absolutely hopeless and I can't do this and my life's over and what am I doing with my life? So definitely.
And that it's all normal. And they say, oh, be, tolerant of ambiguity. I struggle with those kind of things, because I'm like, no, because when you're in it, there's nothing about being tolerable about it, but it's about knowing that it will pass. And I think that's it, that we get caught up with the fact, it will sort itself out. You give it time, you give it incubation, lights occur, you will work yourself out of it. And so you could be hysterical about it, or you could just actually admit that there are times of frustration, anger, grief as you're going through the creative process, but that it's normal. And that in some senses, it leads to the breakthrough, but you can't force the breakthrough. The breakthrough will occur on its own time and schedule.
I tell a few of my clients that.
Paulina says this breakthrough will come not when you need it, but on your own time and schedule. So there, take that. I wish we could all say it. Well, to some degree, I wish that sometimes we do take that. We have very much a performative of productivity and actually having to answer things and do things quickly or whatever. And we do actually squeeze the life out of the space that we need to think deeper about things in our lives.
Yes, and I think there's probably macro and micro versions of that, right? Like within your day versus within a week, you're like, give yourself space, like you're saying, have a break, have an excursion or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, even the concept that time is money is a concept of the Industrial Revolution. Before then, there was not really a concept of time. There wasn't really a concept of watches. You showed up at somebody's house when you showed up. You left your calling card. They weren't home. They weren't home. I don't know how the opera ever began, but I guess enough people were in the audience and they thought, we'll raise the curtains. But now we're firmly in this world of time is money, and remembering that some of these constructs are really relatively new.
Wow.
Yeah, and they're not the constructs that everyone's using either. You can choose some of these how valuable, they are to you as well. There's choice, Joe. Yeah.
True, but I would say that collectively we're quite brainwashed into time is money and that we need to be more productive. Yeah. And it's about questioning those frames, making sure that they still suit you. Cool. Wow. Any other questions while you've got the floor? No?
No, I think I'm good. I mean, there's a lot of things to kind of,
yes,
a lot of things to go and
ponder
deep dive into now. So thank you very much.
You're very, very welcome.
Yeah.
Let's see, looking at this CNA chat. Well, I think we've actually, at this present point, actually have only one other person on the call. So Cheryl, if you want to actually ask a question, you are very welcome to. And if you want to say incognito, I totally respect that. Or if you're wandering off and doing the dishes and having dinner or playing with the cat, in the spirit of being creative, go for that too. Cool. All right. Well, based on that, we don't actually have anything on the chat either. So I think we will wrap this up.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, thank you very much, Sunny, for a wonderful.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, discussion, and thank you for coming back for a repeat on performance due to technical issues last time. We're getting better at this all the time. And,
thank you for leading me down that branching path.
Talking about mathematics and ethical
I think I'll be,
thinking.
I mean,
and
like,
then LSD to throw in.
You threw a lot there. I mean, I'd love to talk about them. So
yes,
yeah.
Definitely. So maybe go deeper on them next time. But thank you everyone for giving up your time. And I can see a clap in the corner. So lovely and very much appreciated. And yes, we'll speak again soon. And Matt, I hope I see you soon.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, really nice. Studies, and look forward to catching up soon. And glad you got a chance to meet Sunny as well.
Yes, great to meet you, Sunny. Appreciate it, guys. Incredible.
Cool.
Thank you.
All right. Let you go, and we'll speak soon. See ya.
See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.